Welcome back, Forward 50. I am so pleased to be kicking off the final session of the Industry Innovations channel. Now, much has been said about the tension between private tech companies and the public sector. How do governments benefit from cutting-edge tech and economy of scale, efficiency while avoiding platform dependency and maintaining the public trust? This candid discussion with senior executives from leading technology innovators will shed some light on the careful balance of delivering to government. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this conversation. You may recognize her if you joined us on our keynote stage this morning. Welcome, Emma Gowan. Hi, Emma.
Hi, Catherine.
Emma will be joined today by Tony Holmes, practice lead for solutions architects at Public Sector for Pluralsight, as well as Malika Mamond, co-founder and CEO of Esper, Ben Sanders, co-founder and CEO of Proof, and Lana Sherman, director at BiasProof. Take it away, you guys.
Well, thank you. Firstly, welcome to our session. I'm really excited to be here this evening or afternoon for you, but it's evening for me. And thank you so much for choosing to spend this time with us. This is going to be an unscripted conversation, so do forgive any technical hitches. But what we want to explore today is the tension between tech companies and the public sector. And actually, it's really interesting to start with the idea of tension, because, of course, we know that the public sector is heavily dependent on the private sector providers of technology in both good ways and sometimes not so good ways. And there's a spectrum of those who believe that the private sector has all the answers and we should outsource technology completely. There's a different framing which says that certainly at the service delivery end, tech or digital is government now. And to manage that effectively, you have to have leadership and some capacity in-house. But I have with me four really interesting folk who, as Catherine said, are innovating, and I want to explore what that means and how they work with government. So let's get things kicked off with a quick round of introductions. And we're going to ask everyone to kind of introduce themselves and say what your company delivers to government and one thing that has surprised you about working with the public sector. I'm going to hand first to Ben.
Hi, thanks, Emma. I'm the CEO of Proof, and I'm participating today from Whitehorse, Yukon. It's Canada's Alaska, for those of you who are international. It's also the traditional territory of the Kwanlin Dun and the Ta'ang Quechan Council. I'm a serial entrepreneur. Proof is my third tech startup, but I've been passionate about government my whole life. I job shadowed my mayor and premier and worked as a page in the Canadian House of Commons, even ran for MP. And Proof is building a platform of doing three things: forms, approvals, and signatures. We're predominantly serving governments at all levels across Canada, and we only work for government. I think the biggest surprise, Emma, for me before getting into this, because I was familiar enough with government to know about the Byzantine procurement challenges, but I didn't know they would be this hard. As an example, our latest contract, which is a low dollar contract at the federal level, supposed to be easier that way and faster to kind of get a pilot going. It's been more than a year in the works. It was signed months ago, and unfortunately, this department can't afford the $2 test payment to send through to set us up as a vendor in the system. So just as an example of one of the challenges that we face.
That sounds very familiar, Ben. Over to Malika.
Thank you, Emma. Great to be here. My name is Malika Momand. I'm the co-founder and CEO of a GovTech company called Esper. I'm headquartered here in Austin, Texas, in our very warehouse-looking office. I promise we have heat. We are a tech company that provides a platform for government agencies to create and manage public policy. So everything from regulations to laws, guidance documents, memos, manuals. Right now, a lot of governments manage that through very disparate processes, and there's a lot of institutional knowledge lost, workflow inefficiencies, things like that. And our software sort of marries all these processes together in a single system of record to boost internal transparency, accountability, and also citizen engagement. We are based in the US and work a lot with the state and federal government here and some local. And, Ben, you had a really great answer around procurement. I think that was going to be mine, but I might diversify slightly now. I think I'm always a bit surprised by the tech literacy in government and how low it can be. And I understand, like, it's usually a little bit behind the private sector in terms of technology advancement, but sometimes we'll go into government agencies and have to explain the value of enterprise software, and why that is different from something that you might install to your computer. So we've done a lot of work on market education around enterprise SaaS. And I think that like COVID probably catalyzed a lot of adoption of SaaS in government, but it's still something that needs work.
Yeah, that's something that's had a lot of debate over this conference, actually, and I'd like to come back to it a little bit later. Tony, I'm really interested, actually, because you're in a small company now, but have a career further back of being in quite a different beast.
Yeah. So I'm Tony Holmes. I work for Pluralsight. We're a tech skills provider. I primarily focus on the public sector, so that's US and Canada, federal, state, and local, and higher education as well. The way we interact with government is we bring artificial intelligence and machine learning tools to help them understand skill gaps and to help them change the way they think about potentially hiring people, about the kind of people that they need, and perhaps challenge the way they think about education, about upskilling and cross-skilling, and more importantly these days, reskilling. I think if I was to kind of identify what surprised me about government, I've been working with government for a long time, and I was gonna echo the same that the other panelists have echoed so far, which is, working with government, working with procurement. I think when I first started working with government, I was told that it was likened to turning an oil tanker. You need a great deal of time and a great deal of space, and you just have to be patient and wait for that thing to happen. But I think one of the other things that surprised me is the very, very institutionalized attitudes, as in it's very, very difficult to be creative, and that mindset tends to permeate all the way through government. So I think that's one of the things that surprised me, is is the government likes to want to be creative. There are definitely people that want to be more creative about the way that they do things, but it's a very institutionalized environment by the nature of the business that they do, and it makes it very hard for that to happen.
Yeah, absolutely, Tony. And I think I've seen public service characterized as people who tend to be rule followers, and that's not always the case, but institutionally there's a feeling that you're doing this for public service, you're doing it to follow the rules, and actually that can mean that some practices ossify and just stay there and no one really questions them, and that's for good reasons, but we sort of get stuck with them. Fantastic. Over to Lana.
Oh, thank you for having me. My name is Lana Sherman. I'm speaking to you from Toronto, which is the traditional lands of the Seneca and Mississauga of the Credit, and I'm grateful for the use of the land. My background is as a director. I work as on boards for public and private companies, and my general approach is towards strategic, ethical, artificial intelligence and socially responsible growth. And I help companies shift their policies to support diversity and inclusion. I would say the thing that has surprised me the most about working with government is really how positive that experience can be if the right person is across the table from you and if they have the power and the motivation to change things. And that has been primarily in real estate, and it has gone both ways. It has had bad days as well. Today I'm representing a company called Bias Proof. It's a technology company. They provide a very simple online test that helps people identify their unconscious bias. And with that tool, we can then move towards changing systematic bias in our society, which is a very positive step forward.
Thanks everyone for the introduction. And to introduce myself briefly, I've worked in government and I'm now working outside government. And I would say I've worked with some really brilliant vendors in that time and some really quite terrible ones delivering bad service and terrible quality. And I'm really interested in the structural reasons that comes about and that it's allowed to last like it does. So that's always an interesting tension as well. But one thing I want to touch on. So in the opening keynote of this conference, Catherine Novello, the new federal CIO in Canada, she talked about the importance of safe, secure services, and how government can't afford services to fail. And often governments try to manage that risk by buying from big vendors. And while I completely understand the sentiment behind it, I think it can be challenging. If you go in with that context, then it's quite hard to justify buying from a startup. So in that context, I'd like to know from you, why should government risk buying from a startup if their priority is reliability and security of service? And Malika, I'd love to pass to you for that one.
I'm smiling because we're going through this, and I think Ben probably has a similar experience at Proof. So in the US, and I believe there's an equivalent in Canada as well, there's something called FedRAMP, which is a security audit that you must have in order to hold a contract with the federal government. And it's a very expensive process, very time-intensive process as well, and not something that most startups can afford, frankly. And so it really limits the range of options that a government agency can buy from at the federal level. And, when you talk about really big companies, consulting firms, yes, they do have FedRAMP authorization, but they're also not necessarily able to move at the speed of a startup and have the same level of creativity and creative destruction that a startup can bring in a positive way. So that's kind of the trade-off, right? Is, you can get a big company who's reliable, but perhaps a bit slow and maybe not the most forward-looking or proactive company or partner that your agency wants to work with. Or you can work with a startup that, has more creative flexibility and can be more inventive with the solutions that your government will need. One of the ways that we got around this at the federal level, because we do have a federal contract with the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, you can actually be sponsored through the FedRAMP process, where an agency kind of holds your hand through it, for lack of a better metaphor. And that can make the time and cost variables slightly less exorbitant for startups. So that's one solution to this. But I think that governments do need to acknowledge that by putting really heightened security requirements, which are absolutely justifiable, you are going to limit the range of creative options you can get, and you can use procurement or other creative vehicles as a way to get more innovative solutions in without that really high barrier to entry.
I'd love to jump in on that too, Emma. Is that all right?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm really excited that Catherine has joined as the new CIO for the Government of Canada from the private sector. I think that's a really exciting thing. I'm excited to see what she'll be able to bring to shake things up. But I would challenge the statement by saying that it's actually impossible to not fail. And I think that governments need to build in a tolerance for failure, not only to accept the realities of that, but because that's the only way that innovation happens. And startups and innovative companies actually embrace failure, and they try and fail as quickly as possible, very much expecting that they're going to fail a lot, but quickly enough to learn from it to make things better. And if you start with the pretense that you can't possibly fail, you set up too much rigidity in the process, and that's actually the thing that will make it fail the most. Security is important, and as Malika pointed out, we're going through the process to try and be able to be the equivalent of FedRAMP in Canada. I think only 3 vendors have made it through. It's a super new process. It's really hard to get in. We're a small team of 10, and it's cost us hundreds of thousands of dollars just to get the certificates ready, and it's taken more than a year. They're just kind of now opening our file to review it. And it's important to have these pieces in place, but I think there are ways to make it secure and still allow for a level of failure and experimentation. And that's critical. And I would add an exciting example that I think is from your part of the world, Emma, with the UK. In 2014, they said, hey, let's consolidate all 3 levels of data classifications unclass, restricted, confidential into one and just call it official. 90% of government material resides within that. And there was no direct mapping between the new and the old system. And they made individuals personally responsible and accountable for exercising good judgment. Contrast that with Canada today, where we still have Pro A, Pro B, Pro C, and though in 2018, we have made it possible to unblock modern online tools and services, and this summer made it possible to pay and accept those terms, there still isn't a way for government employees to get past the restrictions around data sensitivity. So effectively, most modern innovation from the entire world is still inaccessible to government of Canada. And that's a real problem because government is not going to be able to build all the innovation that the rest of the world has available at a low cost for them. So we have to find a way to be secure, but also fail. And that's by making the rules less onerous.
Yeah, and we also had a sort of philosophy in the UK that the bigger it is, the more likely it is to fail. And actually, the larger the contract size up, the more likely it is. And that change in the classifications was, I think, incredibly important and powerful. And with it went this understanding that to manage information that was at that official level could be managed by commercially available cloud software rather than bespoke things for government. And that seemingly small policy change has unlocked a huge amount of potential. But I want to bring in Tony and Lana, so it'd be interesting to get maybe a slightly different perspective. So Lana, your company has looks at unconscious bias and how we can eliminate that. But governments actually typically have fairly onerous recruitment procedures and qualification requirements forms. How do you go about bringing what you do into that already fairly onerous process and convincing people that that's the right thing to do?
I think as a society, we've accepted that we have biases and that we need to overcome them in order to have inclusion and diversity, particularly in the workplace. There have been studies that have been done that have proven that deleting the name of the applicant from the application actually changes who is allowed to come in for an interview. But imagine that instead of doing that, you have every person along the process take a very small test. They're the only ones who see the results, but they identify the implicit bias this person doesn't even know they have. So the person who's scanning the interviews, the person who's then referred to for the first interviews, and then the person who is going to look at whether they're going to hire this person or not. So do you have any biases as you're scanning? Do you have any biases as you're interviewing people? If you don't know if you have these biases, then perhaps you don't know that you're biased against a person who's black or white, or against a woman or a man, or if you have an issue with somebody because of their religion, or obesity. Obesity is a huge issue, especially in the United States. So imagine that instead of just taking one small step as in deleting a person's name, we actually show people we're not condemning them for anything. We're not judging them. We're just informing them. So every person is now aware of what biases they have, if they're big, if they're small, and we leave it in their hands on how to change their life and how to change the life of the people around them. We empower the people with knowledge. And with that, it changes the attitude of the people who are in government. Not just in government, also happens in public and private sector. It happens on boards of directors. But this now allows people to have a conversation at a totally different level. And a government does need to innovate, to the comments that other speakers have made, because the economy is changing and our world is changing. And if they're not aware of the changes that are coming, how are they going to prepare the people? And how are they going to retrain the workforce? And how are they going to keep the data safe? And to that point, there's no reason why, without procurement and without these complicated processes, the government can't get involved with industry leaders, not people who run Google, for example, but people who are in startups, who see the winds of change, and not necessarily put them through the RFP process, but maybe run a pilot with them, give them a chance to, even for no cost, run their product with the government. It will help the government understand what potential there is. It will then help them brainstorm how to use this technology, how to innovate inside the government, to your point, how you can use outside solutions instead of trying to recreate everything inside and making your own mistakes. And it gives them the opportunity then for the company to say that they've been tested by the government, and now they have a win-win from both sides.
I think it's interesting, Lana, because that has two sides to it. Because of course, sometimes it's the bigger companies that can offer things for free, and actually, I've seen cases where a big company's offered something for free, the government department has become hooked on it, and then the fair and open competition happens, and the big company wins that contract. So I think there's an interesting balance to be had there. But I totally see what you mean.
We find that a lot actually with our clients.
After you, Lana.
Sorry, just saying that we find that with our clients, a lot of the times the smaller companies go through the process of going for an RFP and they find at the end that somebody had already been chosen. And so it discourages them for applying. Plus the whole process in Canada is very onerous. So a startup can't possibly apply. It's just too much and they don't have the ability to go through the process. But if there was a pilot that they could run, or maybe a different stream that could be created for them, that gives them an opportunity to have a level playing field against the big boys.
Thank you,
Lana.
The dirty secret, by the way, is like most RFPs are already written with a vendor in mind. And the goal is, as a company, is for you to be that vendor that like sends the government the requirements that go into the RFP. But to your point about pilots, I'd be curious to hear from other people in the group in this as well. I don't like giving freebies or pilots to government, not because like it's harder as a smaller company, to give something away for free, but I find that governments don't use it if it's free. I think you need to make them pay for it because they've got some skin in the game, and they're able to, even if it's like lower dollar, it still is enough to have them like actually use the software because they pay a little bit of their budget towards it. So I am a strong proponent of pay something, even if it's small rather than free.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes if the government department has worked a bit hard for it, it does make it value, it does make them value it more, as you say. So Tony, I'd be really interested to hear your perspective. You don't build services that government, like citizen-centered services depend on in the same way, but how does this manifest itself for you working with governments?
So I thought it was really interesting actually with your initial statement about the government doesn't want people to fail. To that I would say to the government, you first. Hands up anybody that hasn't found a government department that didn't mess up in some way. But the whole joy of learning is we learn from our mistakes. Okay, one of the great things about bringing small vendors with SaaS to government is, as Ben already mentioned, we've got this fail fast attitude. We try different things, we see what breaks, we fix it, we go back again, and we've got this kind of agile approach, which is very difficult because it's at odds. Even though there's a lot of the government moving to cloud right now, it's still at odds with their approach to how they do business. I had one of my military customers talked to me once when we were talking to them, and they jokingly or half jokingly said, one of the problems that we have is we're really, really good at buying $20 million aircraft carriers, but not so great at buying software solutions because the procurement process isn't set up for it. So I would agree with exactly what Malika said a second ago, which is, allowing people to try systems, but making sure that there's a solution there, making sure that there's skin in the game. We don't supply something that the government can fail on exactly. Obviously, we supply upskilling solutions and help governments identify a skill gap analysis within the technology sector. But still, if we give them incorrect data, if we give them incorrect solutions, it doesn't help them run their business. I would say that it's very difficult to add to what the other panelists have already said, other than the fact that I think Malika hit the nail on the head when she said, we have to make sure, in our experience as well, if we just toss some services over the fence to the government and say, hey, go and give this a try, there is no impetus for them. There's no investment for them. And what generally happens is at the end of the trial period, however long that be, they'll say something along the lines, well, people didn't really use it. Well, of course they didn't. I think that there's always going to be this tension because startups again, their job is to test new ground, to innovate, to try new things. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring those new and exciting technologies and ideas to the government. And I think in order for the partnership to work better, someone kind of needs to take a step back and say, if we want the greatest ideas, if we want the latest concepts brought to government and be able to apply them to our taxpayers and our stakeholders, then we need to relax our attitude a little bit, and we need to take a breath and step back and say, okay, let's talk about acceptable risk rather than taking this concept, as Malika mentioned as well, with FedRAMP. We've got all of the security, and then we've got none of the security, and there has to be kind of something in between that to help the government work with innovators and bring that innovation to public sector.
Thanks, Tony. And that concept of risk can be quite an interesting one, I think, in government, because you spend so much time controlling for risk that actually what happens again is that you end up standing still, and in fact the risk gets larger and larger over time. I'd like to kind of move on to a slightly different question and just say, and I fear the answer is procurement, so maybe think about if there are other answers, but what's blocking you from working with the public sector? Like, what's one thing that you might change? And it can be procurement, but it'd be interesting to know if there's something else.
I've got a kind of a spiky, controversial idea to throw out there. Here's an example, and I'll give you some context after, but government shouldn't try and build everything perfectly upfront, right? Especially at the cost of never launching for anyone. So often when we're examining a pilot use case, paid, I think it's a great point, Malika, we get thrown with kind of accessibility requirements that are incredibly onerous. And I think there's a disconnect in the realization that, one of my early investors created Gmail, right? And like the products we use from Google for free, they've had billions of dollars of investment in them. We're a 10-person team, and the expectation for us for a pilot as an experiment to meet the same kind of standards is something that really blocks us. Now, first off, let me point out that accessibility matters a great deal to me. I have friends and family for whom accessibility is a critical need. And I believe that government plays an important role in servicing that so that there's the same kind of availability for everyone. But I think too often government will choose not to change from a broken system that already isn't accessible because it's on paper, not serving a digital community, because 1 out of 30 checkboxes doesn't get met. And as an example, our platform, we do a lot of kind of digitizing paper forms and then kind of approvals on the back end to cut out the red tape so that things can move through the system faster. And our forms side of the platform is bilingual, it's accessible, so it meets that requirement for which 95% of the users are going to experience it. There's only 5% that use the back end, and that part isn't accessible yet. And often that's a reason why they won't try us or start with us in the first place. And if that bar is too high, it's impossible for anyone to really get in, and government's putting up too much of a wall at their own deficit.
Yeah, that's interesting, Ben, because it is something that quite gets often added to procurement. And I feel like it's intended to drive up quality, but you find that procurements end up having all sorts of requirements about equity, about accessibility. We used to have green IT requirements, and all of them in there for absolutely good reason. But then, if you're a startup trying to get in, it makes it really hard. Tony, I'd be interested in your view on this question. Like, if there's something that you would unblock.
Yeah, I think one of the things that really fascinates me about this, and it resonates, but it's an entirely different sphere within the government. But they apply exactly the same logic when it comes to hiring people, when it comes to bringing new talent on board, is they set the bar so high. And anybody that's looked at federal hiring policies and the jobs that they recommend, they want, literally a long laundry list of requirements for this person to come on board. And essentially, instead of solving the problem that all of the governments say they have, which is, we have this problem where there isn't enough people to meet the requirements of the workplace. Instead of making it easier and thinking about how we can do it differently, we continue to keep the process the same. And to quote one of my favorite authors, Rory Sutherland, it's much easier to be fired for being illogical than it is for being unimaginative. The fatal issue is that logic always gets you to the same place that you were when you were being logical before. So I think the whole concept of this person needs to be able to do these 300 things and excluding 95% of your candidate pool should be kind of tempered with being a little bit more creative. What are some other traits that are important that we can build workers on where we don't have to exclude quite so many people? How can we be more inclusive and give ourselves a greater opportunity at closing this yawning skills gap that we apparently have, that we're not moving forward to closing right now? So I think from that perspective, if I could change one thing, it wouldn't necessarily be procurement. It'd be the way that the government attracts talent, the way the public sector hires talent, the way they recruit it, and the way one of the conversations I have, one of the talks I give is called "How do you hire an astronaut?" Because there are many traits that we can hire for that are going to be of huge benefit to the public sector that we just push away because we want that 4-year degree, or we want that experience with this particular government framework or that particular government procurement method. When in actual fact, if you hire people with the right traits, these skills can be learned, and that's exactly our business. These skills can be learned in a matter of 3 or 6 months. And what you have then is you have an incredibly talented, well-rounded individual that you've grown to have those skills. And that's exactly how we hire astronauts, or we hire intelligence operatives and all those kinds of people. So that would be it, is how the government attracts, retains, and builds talent.
I love that, Tony. I wanted to be an astronaut. I used to work with NASA, and there's an interesting example there that I learned, that making too many safety checks can actually make something less safe, right? So NASA innovated early on when we got people to land on the moon, and then there were some accidents, and ultimately we started putting in a checklist every time something failed, which is important to some extent. But when you know that 10 other people are going to check the tightness of that bolt, then every once in a while, all 10 people will say, oh, somebody else was probably going to check that. And it's actually becomes a problem. If you look at how SpaceX is totally innovating and helping government now access space, it's by treating Agile not as an additive process, but as a subtractive one. What can we take away that isn't required? And maybe we'll add it later, but do we need 30 accessibility checkpoints on day one to try this as a pilot to see if it'll work? Probably not. Let's add them at the end.
I'm interested to kind of pick at that question of Malika. Earlier, you used the phrase creative destruction, and I like it a lot, and I know how you meant it, but I think that would sound quite scary if you're in government. How do you reconcile that?
I think a lot of what we're talking about on this panel, and I think broadly, is just around risk management. When you were asking like what's blocking me, something that's come up recently is around marketing customer wins. So as a tech company, the most valuable thing that we can do to our customers besides deliver a great product is to give them social proof that other people really like our product. So if you are in the Tennessee Department of Health and you're thinking about purchasing Esper, you want to know, well, are other departments of health in the US using Esper? And so it's part of our standard protocol to do a press release or do some sort of customer case study or profile saying, we're happy to work with you. Here's how we're helping this agency, and sort of spreading the word. And you would think that would be great. The government would love the attention and they're happy to share their story about all the efficiencies they're realizing, but it's actually not the case. They're like, we don't want to market that we're spending money. We don't want to show that we're adopting something new or innovative or technology. So it's almost like government's comms strategy around technology needs a rebrand. We had a customer say, we love Esper so much, we don't want to show that we're putting too much budget towards technology, which feels so backward thinking when you hear it out loud. So I think that most government agencies, when they think of press or communications or marketing, it's almost always through a negative light. The agency had some big screw up and they have to come in with a cleanup crew and do a lot of press to fix it. Whereas I think that government should also be open to like highlighting the wins. Here are things that we're doing that are going really well. You should know about them. And that requires moving the mindset away from risk and being so protective to being more open and flexible and saying, yeah, we're happy about this. You should know about it too.
Yeah, 100% agree. I feel like there's a lot of nervousness about those vast amounts of money that gets spent on legacy tech, and then that's created this nervousness that then translates into talking about it. For the smaller wins that you're talking about, that are actually incredibly transformative. Lana, I'd be interested in your perspective too, though. How might you be unblocked from working with government?
I think a government can take note from how large corporations run, and institutions, hospitals. One of the things that they do when they want to implement change is they create an innovation subcommittee. So you have the general board of directors, they bring people on from the board and a few outsiders, and now they're tasked with bringing innovation to the company. It could be either in the form of new products or processes or whatever it is. That committee is then applauded for ideas that they bring forward, and they're championed within the organization for what they can deliver. And similarly, the government can have a path like this also, so that there's opportunities to run pilots, there's opportunities to try things, and that government agency then gets the press that it needs and applauded for implementing innovation. And I think that could work very well. The subcommittee doesn't have to have all the answers. The people on that committee actually bring in talent all the time, and they look at specific qualities that other companies can deliver. So if you want to innovate a process for document management, you'll bring in 3 or 4 different companies that explain their different processes. And then on the committee, you will have people who understand that industry and can give you their opinions about the processes these different companies have. That will help you select one, as opposed to going through this complicated RFP process. And then there are companies who test technology and safety. I mean, the banks do it all the time. They have outsiders who provide their hosting and their services. It's not always done indoors. And there's companies who can provide you a safety certificate. No, it's not perfect, but it's pretty close and it's pretty good. And now you have an opportunity for real talent to come forward, people that the government would have never been able to touch. And instead of hiding and saying we're spending money and we can't tell anyone, it's the other way around. We have a budget, it's $10 million. We're going to grow the talent in Canada. We're going to allow people who are already here to build their companies. And maybe it's not a pure startup, maybe it's a small size company, mid-size company. And then you layer that with government ability to expand those services outside the Canadian borders, so that instead of having internationals gobble up our Canadian talent and maybe move head office or maybe grow talent somewhere else to build that company, you now have growth within Canada. You have new talent coming into Canada. You have immigration. You have all kinds of positive economic effects.
Thank you, Lana, and thank you everyone for a really fantastic and interesting discussion. It's given me a lot to think about in terms of creativity and how startups can bring it. I'm definitely going to go and look up that NASA work, Ben. That sounds incredibly fascinating, and I've not heard about it. And I think we're all fairly aligned as well on this idea of risk, which is that government, in the pursuit of avoiding it, sometimes runs directly into it. And actually, part of getting startups to work with government in a more straightforward way would be to reframe that and be a little bit less afraid of failure. I think that is easier said than done, because if you're an elected official, it's a different profile, and you have to handle different things than we do in our world. But a little bit of a step in the right direction, a bit of experimentation would certainly go a long way to helping us work more successfully with governments and bring innovations their way. So thank you, everyone. And I think Catherine will point us in the right direction, but I think we're all available for questions after this.
Awesome.